Good evening. Good evening. Good night. We could all have pizza and everything would be good right now. Good to see everyone this evening. We've been in 1 Samuel, or kind of starting 1 Samuel, and like I said, it's a story, isn't it? A story of a long time ago. And I think when I read Samuel especially, like I said, so many great Bible stories come out of Samuel. And I think when we think about Samuel, we just naturally kind of gravitate towards that, David and Goliath, and, those stories that kind of resonate. David's victories and, things that he did. And we kind of resonate towards that. But I think it's a much deeper book than that. And, there's a lot of it that sometimes is difficult to understand, because a lot of times in ancient text, you kind of get things chronologically kind of messed up a little bit, and we kind of got to deal with that sometimes. But especially, I think in the beginning of this, it's a real chronological. We talked about Eli's sons, about their sin that they committed, and the fact that they were worthless men that didn't know the Lord. And we talked about that quite a bit last Sunday. And I think when that's kind of what opened the door for Samuel, right? Because Eli's boys didn't know the Lord. And every year when Hannah comes, she brings him something to wear. She gets to speak to him once a year. She gets to see him. She's blessed with other children, and we talked about that a little bit. He's of that lineage, of a priestly lineage. We talked about that a little bit. Eli tried to rebuke his sons. Why do you do such things? The evil I hear from these people. The report is not good, which I hear the Lord's people circulating. If one man sins against another, God will mediate, but if a man sins against the Lord, who can intercede? And, that's really a Job thing. Job really went into that. I wish there was somebody to stand between me and God. The idea that God's kind of untouchable, unreachable, that, you need this mediator in the middle. Eli says if, a man sins against God, there's a priest in the middle. There's a priest to mediate. But especially under the old law, if you sinned against God, there was nobody there to mediate into that. And so as Samuel increases, Eli's sons decrease. And this is kind of where we got to last week. So the man of God comes to him, basically says, you're not going to have any old people in your house. I'm going to wipe you out. I want to wipe out your lineage. And I talked about how much of a problem that was in Judaism, because your lineage was your eternity. It was to a lot of them, that was how you lived on, was through your seed. And if you took that away, it was kind of like taking heaven away, kind of like taking that eternity away, because your seed is not going to continue. And that's what God's telling Eli here. He says, your seed, there's not going to be any old people in your house. Your seed's not going to continue. And he says, I indeed say that your house and the house of your father should walk before me forever. But now the Lord declares, far be it from me, for those who honor me I will honor, and those who despise me will be lightly esteemed. And he says, the days are coming when I will break your strength and the strength of your father's house, so that there will not be an old man in your house. You will see the distress of my dwelling, in spite of all the good that I do for Israel, and old men will not be in your house forever. Yet I will not cut off every man of yours from my altar, so that your eyes will fail from weeping and your soul grieve, and all the increase of your house will die in the prime of life. This will be a sign to you which will come concerning your sons, Hophni and Phinehas. On the same day both of them will die. But I will raise up for myself a faithful priest who will do according to what is in my heart and in my soul. And I will build him an enduring house, and he will walk before me anointed always. So God's already looking towards Samuel here. Your boys are both going to die on the same day. There's not going to be an old man in your house. They're not going to totally cut you off, but basically your lineage is going to go away. Somebody else is going to be raised up to fill your place, to fill your station where your children should have been. And this is kind of this prophecy that we're going to give you. This is this prophecy God's giving Eli. So Eli's been a faithful priest. Eli's been a good priest. But now, because of this transgression of Eli's sons, God's going to turn away from him. Everyone who has left your house will come and bow down to him for a piece of silver, for silver a loaf of bread, and say, please assign me and one of the priest's officers so that I may eat a piece of bread. So they're saying, your boys are not going to lead. They're going to have to come to this priest I'm going to raise up. He's going to tell them. He's going to basically dictate what they do. So at this time, yeah, go ahead. Well, I don't know if he did. I mean, it doesn't really say that he did. I mean, it's possible. Yeah. Yeah, your house, basically. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, Eli wasn't innocent necessarily in the whole thing. And I think when you look at the Old Testament especially, God says, I'm going to bring it on the third and fourth generation. And we talk about that a lot. What does that mean, for God to bring it, for it to go forward 3 and 4 generations. But this is really what it means is that, if the father messed up, then basically generations beyond that would pay for his transgression. And, of course, here it's not just Eli, but Eli's accountable, right? They're his children. Hophni and Enos are his children. He's accountable to them. You don't see the mother mentioned here. The mother's not accountable for those kids. It's Eli who's accountable before God. Eli has to answer for this. And so this is what's bringing in. And we're getting this really to get us to Samuel. Samuel was called directly by God. He's one of the people in the Bible who was directly called by God. Samuel was ministering for the Lord before Eli. And a word from the Lord was rare in those days, it says. And that's common in the Old Testament. It's funny when you really read, people come to me and say, well, I don't really get the Old Testament. And I mean, I can understand that. We're not Jewish. We weren't raised in the Old Testament. Most of us didn't grow up studying the Old Testament. The reason we don't get it, a lot of us, is because we don't understand that really the Old Testament is divided into these sections. And to really understand it, you really have to understand that concept, So you got your first 5 books, right? Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, the Pentateuch. Now those are books of law. That's what Moses wrote, right? That's what Moses wrote. Then it's kind of chronological, right? We get Judges, because Judges come. Joshua comes, we get Judges, we go through Judges. Then we get into Samuel. Samuel's a judge and a priest and a prophet. So Samuel wears a lot of hats here. That's how it makes Samuel very unique. Judges that, in the book of Judges, they would just come up for a little while. Some of them just a few months. Some of them just to do one thing, right? They weren't like judges everywhere. And a judge was never over all of Israel, ever. Judges, that's not how judges work. Judges were over a certain thing. Like when Samson was raised up, he was raised up to defeat the Philistines, right? That was Samson's mission in life. He was to fight the Philistines. Gideon, he was fighting the Midianites, you see. So just because you had these guys, they weren't kings. They weren't prophets. They were people that God raised up basically to fight a battle or fight a war or fight a conflict for Israel, kind of to redeem Israel, because Israel would fall away and they would cry to God, and God would raise up a judge, and the judge would come along and he would kind of rescue them. Then they would fall away again. That's what gets you to Samuel. So there's no kings here. No kings. There's no ruler over all of Israel. Nobody. So Israel's basically the capital of Israel, if you want to look at it that way, is the temple, which is at Shiloh. No Jerusalem yet. We don't have Jerusalem until we get to David. So that's the capital where the tabernacle is. And the basic ruler of Israel is the priest, the high priest. He's the one who, if there's anybody with authority in Israel, he's the guy. He's the man. Now, we're going to see that change in Samuel because we're going to get a king. We're going to get kings. But when you get past 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, which is kind of the same thing, right? Kind of the same time period. So you got Judges, 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, and it's just about that time frame, basically about Israel becoming a nation, about the kings, about the judges, about all that stuff. And then you kind of shuts up, okay? And really, then when you start get to prophets, really that has to deal mostly, 90% of it is with Babylonian captivity and them coming back to Israel, you know. So there's a lot of thousands of years in there. We're talking about thousands of years of history, thousands of years. And we don't have that much. So there's a lot of times in the Old Testament, God wasn't saying anything. God wasn't talking. God wasn't speaking. He just wasn't. We don't have it. So, you know, those are kind of how the Old Testament gets kind of laid out. And then in the middle of that, you have the poetry books, right? And poetry books were mostly David, Solomon, Job, right? But what do you have in poetry? You got Job, you got Proverbs, Psalms, which is mostly David, Song of Songs, which is Solomon, right? Ecclesiastes, which is Solomon. 5 books of poetry. That's all basically David and Solomon. All that's basically David and Solomon. So it kind of fits into that 1st and 2nd Samuel. You see what I'm saying? A lot of that is concurrent. 1st and 2nd Samuel, you know, everything but Job in the book of poetry is all kind of in that spot. 1st, 2nd Kings, 1st, 2nd Chronicles, 1st, 2nd Samuel, you know, Ecclesiastes, Proverbs, Psalms, Song of Songs are all in that. They're all in that same time period. They're all in that little time frame right there where we're talking about David and Saul and Solomon. They're all in that group. So, you know, it's not. So a lot of times people look at the Old Testament and they're like, well, one thing, it's not chronological at all. And the other thing is that they're trying to put a big story together, and you really can't because it's not built that way. But in Samuel, although we could go to 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles, and there's going to be parallels to Samuel, Samuel kind of has a chronological feel story to it more than other books of the Bible, more than other Old Testament books. And maybe that's why it's a little easier for us to look at 1st and 2nd Samuel than it is to look at some of them other books. David here, he was lying down, and Eli's sight gets dim. We see that a lot in there. The lamp of God had not yet gone out, which we're talking about the lamp on the table here. That's what we're talking about. The table shall bear the lamp, the menorah lamp, which is in the outer part, the holy part of the temple, of the tabernacle. This isn't a temple. Tabernacle. No temple yet. Still in a tent. Okay. And so it says, and Samuel was lying down in the temple of the Lord where the ark of God was. And that's a really interesting statement because, you know, basically I don't think he's saying he's in the Holy of Holies. He's not in the compartment where the ark is, but he's in that temple area. He's in that compound area. The Lord called Samuel and he said, here I am. And he ran to Eli and said, here I am, you called me. But he said, I did not call. He lied down again, went and lied down. And the Lord called yet again Samuel. So Samuel arose and went, and Eli said, here I am, for you called me. But he answered, I did not call you, my son. Lie down again. Now Samuel did not yet know the Lord nor had the word of the Lord yet been revealed to him. So the Lord called Samuel again for the third time, and he arose and went to Eli and said, "Here I am, for you called me." And then Eli discerned the Lord was calling the boy. And Eli said to Samuel, "Go lie down, and it shall be if he calls you that you shall say, 'Speak, Lord, for your servant's listening.'" So Samuel went and lay down, and the Lord came and stood and called as at the other times, and Samuel, Samuel, and Samuel said, "Speak, for your servant is listening." And the Lord said to Samuel, "Behold, I'm about to do a thing in Israel at which both." So this is a revelation, right? This is God speaking directly to Samuel. It doesn't happen much in the Bible. God very seldom speaks directly to an individual. Hardly ever happens. So this is really unique. And God is wanting to reveal something to Samuel, because he says, "In that day I will carry out against Eli all I have spoken concerning his house from beginning to end. For I have told him that I am about to judge his house forever for the iniquity which he knew." Goes right back to what Sherry was saying, right? He knew what was going on, right? But he didn't stop it. He didn't put a stop to it. Accountability with God, right? Accountability. In the New Testament, when it talks about the sin of Adam and Eve, it's always Adam, right? It's Adam's sin. Never says Eve's sin. Always says Adam's sin, doesn't it, in the Bible, right? Adam was accountable. And when the Lord confronted him, he said it was that woman, right? But God says, "No, you're accountable. You're the man. You're the head of the household. You're accountable." And that's kind of how it goes in the Bible. Men kind of carry that weight in Scripture, and that's just kind of how it's laid out, kind of how God does it. Responsible for our house. And that's a big thing, I think, for all of us to consider. He said, "I've sworn to the house of Eli that the iniquity of Eli's house shall not be atoned for by sacrificing or offering forever." So Samuel lay down until morning, and he opened the doors of the house of the Lord, and Samuel was afraid to tell the vision to Eli. He didn't want to tell him what the Lord had said. Didn't want to tell him that God was going to destroy his house. But it's interesting because Eli, he accepts that, right? Samuel told him everything, hid nothing. And he said, "It is the Lord. Let him do what seems good to him." Then Samuel grew, and the Lord was with him, and God's going to be with him throughout all of this. The fascinating thing to me at this kind of juncture in Samuel is that, Samuel sees how bad Eli's sons are, and that Eli's held accountable by God for the sins of his sons. And yet Samuel's sons are going to be just as bad. It's kind of like, didn't you wake up on this thing a little bit? Didn't you listen? Because this is going to go the same way for Samuel. This is exactly the same thing's going to happen with Samuel's sons. Samuel's sons are going to be worthless. The people aren't going to want them because they're corrupt. It's like from generation to generation, they don't seem to stay faithful to God, right? All Israel from Dan even to Beersheba know that Samuel was confirmed as a prophet of the Lord. And the Lord appeared again at Shiloh, because the Lord revealed himself to Samuel at Shiloh by the word of the Lord. So, he's bringing that glory back. Israel knows. Israel knows that Samuel has the Lord's ear. Samuel has authority. And so they're going to start looking towards Samuel, leaning towards Samuel to do these things. And now the Lord's prophecy is going to be fulfilled. We move along pretty quickly at the beginning of this. Now God's prophecy is going to be fulfilled by the Philistines. The Philistines are this arch enemy that just keep popping up. They're seafaring folk, and they're not Semites. That's really the interesting thing about the Philistines. Almost every other enemy of Israel is a Semite. They're a descendant, basically, of Abraham. The Hittites, the Moabites, the Perizzites, all these other ites. But the Philistines are different. They came across the Mediterranean. They're seafaring people. They're warfaring people. They've always kind of been the enemy of Israel. And if you look at Samson, he fought the Philistines. Philistines were always against God, and God's going to use bad people to do his will. What do you think about that? God's going to use bad people to do God's will. Does that really does that bother anybody, that God's going to, common. God uses people, has always used people to get his will done. Always. It's never changed. And that's just fascinating to me. God could have done things a million different ways. God could have just did it because he was God. But God never does that. God calls Moses. God calls Samson. God calls Gideon. God calls Samuel. God calls, right? Always does. And whenever God calls somebody, he gives them authority to do what he wants them to do. They have authority, vested authority. God gives them authority by calling them to do what he wants them to do. Here you have a case where God's going to use really bad people, as he often does, the Israel's enemy of Israel, to punish them. Now there's times God punished Israel directly. When they made the golden calf, he caused the earth to open up, right? The sons of Korath, if you've ever read that story, when they challenged Moses and Aaron, God punished them directly. But most of the time, Ananias and Sapphira, right? People that God punished directly, God punished directly. But generally, God doesn't do that. Generally, God uses somebody else to do this. Now, the ark of God is so important, right? Because the ark of God is where God comes to meet Israel, and when Israel atones for their sins. It's got the mercy seat. It's got the cherubims. It's got Aaron's rods that budded. It's got the ark. It's got the Ten Commandments, right? It's got the tablets of stone that Moses brought down off the mount. It's got the manna that they carried in the wilderness inside of it. So the ark is very, very holy, very, very holy. And the Bible says that anybody that touches it, right? Anybody that touches it will die, right? So the ark is very, very holy. It's very, very important to them. When they carry the ark into battle, they win because it's God's presence. It's kind of like a talisman, right? If you carry the ark into battle, you're going to win. But not this time because God's going to make it go a different way. And so the Philistines, they were camped beside Ebenezer. The Philistines were camped. The Philistines drew up a battle array to meet Israel, and when the battle spread, Israel was defeated before the Philistines, who killed 4,000 men on the battlefield. And when the people came into the camp, the elders of Israel said, "Why has the Lord defeated us today before the Philistines? Let us take to ourselves from Shiloh the ark of the covenant of the Lord." So let's go get this talisman, right? This always works. Carry the ark in, and you're going to win. Isn't it interesting they didn't carry it in the first time? You ever notice that? That's how we are, right? We're going to do it we're going to try it our way first. And if that doesn't work, we're going to talk to God about it, right? Instead of talking to God first, we're going to do it our way. They're going into battle against the Philistines. Go get the ark. Go get the priest. Talk to God. See if this thing's going to go the right way. No, we can do it. Then 4,000 of them die, and then it's like, well, let's go get the ark, right? Because this didn't work out so good for us last time. So they go and get the ark, right? And they carry it into battle. And the people sent to Shiloh, and they carried the ark of the covenant of the Lord of hosts, who sits above the cherubim. And the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, were there with the ark of the covenant of God. So, we're going to carry this ark in, we're going to win. But God said, no, that's not how this is going to play out. When the ark of the covenant of the Lord came into the camp, all Israel shouted with a great shout, so the earth resounded. The Philistines heard the noise. They said, "What does the noise, the great shout about the camp of the Hebrews mean?" And they understood the ark of the Lord had come into the camp, and the Philistines were afraid. For they said, "God is coming to the camp." Isn't it amazing how we compartmentalize God? You ever notice that? We still do that. We compartmentalize God. It's like God's here. Have you ever heard that thing? You've probably heard a lot of times that people say, well, there's 2 or 3 of us, so God's here. Is God not here when there's one? You know, we compartmentalize God. We try to say God's here, God's there. We do that. We do that all the time. We do that in worship. We do that, and we always compartmentalize God. But if we really believe that God is omnipresent, which He is, we believe that He's always with us. Why do we go back to that 2 or 3 thing all the time? Do you think? Why do we? You know, it's really not talking about that, is it? It's talking about judging somebody. 2 or 3 people, 2 or 3 witnesses, 2 or 3 to confirm, right? If I'm alone, lost in the woods, is God not going to be there because there's not 2 or 3? Well, we know that's a stupid question, right? We know God's going to be there, don't we? God's going to be in our presence. And yet, when they saw the ark, they said, God's in the camp. Was God not in the camp before? Sure He was, right? Sure He was. You know, you can't build a house to contain God, right? You can't build a building to contain God. God's too big for that. But yet, that's what we do, and that's what they did. God's there. God's in the camp. This is God. Woe to us, for nothing like this has happened before. Woe to us. Who shall deliver us from the hand, and listen to the terminology, of these mighty gods? See that? Because they're plural theistic people, right? In other words, they still don't understand God's one God, right? And so you don't even see it capitalized here. Who's from these mighty gods, right? These are the gods who smote the Egyptian. They still don't understand it's just one God, do they? These are the gods who smote the Egyptians with plagues. Take courage and be men, O Philistines, or you will become slaves to the Hebrews, as they have been slaves to you. Therefore, be men and fight. You know, this really is interesting because we still do the same thing. We still compartmentalize God. We still say God's here, God's not there. God can't be in that place. And yet we understand that's not true. They defeated Israel. Every man fled to his tent. The slaughter was great. For the fall of Israel, 30,000 foot soldiers. Why? Because of the sin of 2 men. Right? You know, sin is this, in the Bible, always has this huge punishment. Huge. And so, you know, you see this huge slaughter. They came from the battle, came to Shiloh, his clothes tore, dust on his head. When he came, behold, Eli was sitting on a seat by the road, eagerly watching, because his heart was trembling for the ark of God. So the men came to tell it in the city, and all the city cried out. When Eli heard the noise, he said, What does the noise of this commotion mean? Then the men came hurriedly and told Eli. Now Eli was 99 years old. His eyes were shut, so he could not see. The man said to Eli, I am the one who came from the battle line. Indeed, I escaped from the battle line today. And he said, how did things go, my son? And the one who brought the news replied, Israel has fled before the Philistines. There has also been a great slaughter among the people, and your 2 sons also, Hophni and Phinehas, are dead, and the ark of God has been taken. And when he mentioned the ark of God, wasn't his sons, it wasn't his sons, it was the ark. His heart was heavy because of the ark. His whole life, he had done one thing. His entire life, he had done one thing. He guarded the ark. His entire life. Right? And when he mentioned the ark, Eli fell off the seat backward beside the gate, and his neck was broken, and he died, for he was old and heavy. And thus he judged Israel 40 years. You know, when we start this is getting us to Samuel. This is the story. This is the tragic story of Eli, right? Who failed. Who served God, who served Israel, but yet he failed, didn't he? He failed with his children. He failed Israel. He failed God. And in the end, he paid a price. It's a tragic story. But it's what brings us to Samuel. You know, the truth is that God is never unjust. God is always just in what he does. God knew why he did this. Eli knew why he did this. It gets worse. Yeah. So His daughter-in-law, Phinehas' wife, was pregnant and about to give birth, and when she heard the news that the ark of God was taken, that her father-in-law and her husband had died, she kneeled down and gave birth, for her pains had come upon her. And about the time of her death, the woman who stood by her said to her, "Do not be afraid, if you give birth to a son." But she did not answer or pay attention, and she called the boy Ichabod, saying, "The glory has departed from Israel, because the ark of God was taken, because her father-in-law and her husband." She said, "The glory has departed from Israel, for the ark of God was taken." So this is going to be, he said it's still going to be somebody be before there, right? There's still going to be some lineage, still going to be somebody, but nobody old in the house. Remember what God said? Nobody old in the house. And so she has this child, Ichabod, and that's why I guess nobody names their child Ichabod, right? It's kind of like Jezebel. It's one of those names nobody goes to. And so so you kind of get this story, right? The beginning of this story, 4 chapters of it. We get the story of Hannah, of Samuel, Eli, Eli's sons, Israel. The ark's gone. The Philistines have the ark of God, and that's going to play back in later as we go through this. And so we get this. So we get this going on. Do you think they opened it? Have you ever seen Raiders of the Lost Ark? And at the end when he opens the box and they don't look, and all of them, their flesh melts off their bones, right? And I've always wondered if the Philistines opened it. I guess they couldn't, right? I mean, they would have died if they touched it, right? But yet they're going to put it on. It's really an interesting story. When God departs, right? If God has departed, then is it still, yet it still represents God, right? It's still this representation of God. It's kind of really interesting. The ark's very fascinating. The ark is going to wind up back, right? We'll see that in the story, but it's going to come back. It's going to wind up in Jerusalem. Solomon's going to put it in the temple, and it's going to be in the temple. And then when the Babylonians come to conquer Israel, the ark disappears into antiquity, and we don't know where it is. We don't have a clue where the ark is. We do know some from apocryphal books that it's hidden in the Temple Mount. That's what Jeremiah says. That was what Jeremiah said it was hidden in the mount in a cave that no one would ever find. So some people think it's in the Temple Mount, which would be underneath the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem. Some people think that's really where the ark's still there. Some people think the ark got carried off to the Babylonians. The Babylonians took the ark and basically destroyed it, or just tore it apart for its material, and that it ceased to exist. And then there's always the ninja monks in Africa that say they have the ark and they're guarding it. Wonderful internet trolling time for you if you want to study the ninja monks of Africa on the Ark of the Covenant. It's a good read. Just Google that and learn about the ninja monks who guard the Ark of God, and nobody can get in there or they'll kill you with their ninja moves. And I'm not kidding. I can't make this up. Google it. Just Google it. You're going to see it. Just Google the ninja monks. Google Ark of God, ninja monks, Africa. You'll get it. It'll come up. And so they claim that it's there. So the ark is one of them 3 places. It's either buried under the Temple Mount, it's destroyed and carried away by the Babylonians, or the ninja monks have it. It's one or the other. So, in a big warehouse somewhere, with a Nazi stamp on it, right? Stamped somewhere with a number. Right. Right. But wherever it is, God doesn't want us to have it anymore, right? Because if we had it, we'd worship it. And God doesn't want us to worship things, does he? God wants us to worship him. Moses, God buried Moses. Remember that? And there's an argument with an angel. Remember that in the New Testament? About where the body of Moses was. Because God didn't want them to know that, because they would have worshiped that tomb. They would have worshiped Moses. God doesn't want us to worship things. God doesn't want us to think that God dwells in things that we make. God wants us to know that he dwells in the human heart, that this whole world is his temple, and that we're to worship him and not objects. So, okay, I'm letting the people go. Let the people go. Thanks for your time.